A hiker found a campsite that was still warm. It started with a report logged late in the afternoon describing a campsite that felt recently abandoned, but no one was nearby. The detail that stood out to everyone was simple. The fire pit still held heat, like someone had left minutes earlier. Rylan Mercer was 32 years old and worked as a seasonal wildfire lookout stationed near a remote mountain range. He spent most of his days scanning tree lines and valleys, watching for smoke that might signal something dangerous before it spread. That morning had been routine, with clear skies and steady wind drifting through the ridges without any sign of trouble. Rylan decided to take a short hike down a lesser-used trail, hoping to check a spot where campers sometimes stopped overnight. The trail itself was narrow and uneven, with patches of loose rock that shifted underfoot if someone moved too quickly. About an hour into the hike, he noticed something unusual ahead, a faint trail of smoke rising between the trees. It was thin and almost invisible at first, blending with the sunlight that filtered down through the tall pine branches. Rylan slowed his pace and adjusted his path, stepping carefully toward the source while listening for any movement nearby. As he got closer, the smell became clearer, not like a wildfire, but like a controlled campfire that had not fully burned out. He stepped into a small clearing and immediately saw the campsite set up in a way that suggested someone had planned to stay. A small tent stood near the edge of the clearing, partially zipped, with no visible damage or signs of forced entry. Next to it sat a backpack, leaning against a log, along with a pair of boots placed neatly side by side. The fire pit in the center still glowed faintly, with embers pulsing under a thin layer of ash that hadn't cooled yet. Rylan crouched near the fire and extended his hand cautiously, feeling the warmth rising steadily from the coals. This was not a fire that had burned out overnight. It was recent, very recent, and that made the silence unsettling. He stood up and called out, his voice echoing lightly through the trees, but there was no response from anywhere nearby. "Hello, anyone here?" he said, again, louder this time, expecting at least some movement or acknowledgement. Nothing answered him, not even the sound of footsteps or branches shifting in the surrounding forest. Rylan moved toward the tent and hesitated before touching it, unsure if someone might still be inside, resting quietly. He unzipped it slowly and looked in, finding a sleeping bag that was still slightly compressed, like it had been used recently. There were no personal items scattered around. Everything seemed organized, as if the person had stepped away intentionally. He stepped back and scanned the ground, looking for footprints or signs of direction, but the soil was too dry to hold detail. The only clear marks were near the fire pit, where someone had recently stirred the coals or added small pieces of wood. Rylan's radio crackled softly at his side, breaking the silence, but it was just routine chatter from the lookout station above. He picked it up and considered calling in the situation, but paused, unsure if this was an emergency or just a strange coincidence. Then he noticed something else that didn't fit, a metal cup sitting near the fire with liquid still inside it. He leaned down and touched the side of the cup, and it was warm, not hot, but definitely not cold either. That detail shifted everything in his mind because it meant whoever had been here had left very recently, within minutes. Rylan stood still and listened again, this time focusing harder, trying to detect anything out of place in the surrounding woods. At first, there was nothing, just the soft movement of wind through branches and distant birds calling to each other. Then, faintly, he heard something else, a subtle sound that didn't belong to nature, like a step on dry leaves. He turned quickly toward the direction of the noise, his eyes scanning the trees, trying to catch even the slightest movement. But the forest looked empty, completely still, as if nothing had been there at all. Rylan tightened his grip on the radio and spoke into it, keeping his voice controlled but firm. "I found a campsite off Ridge Trail. Recent activity, no occupants in sight. Requesting guidance on next steps." The response came after a brief pause, calm but curious, asking him to remain on site and gather more details if possible. Rylan acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt, then took a slow step toward the edge of the clearing. He didn't know why, but the feeling in his chest had changed. Something about the place felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. The warmth of the fire, the order of the campsite, and the complete absence of its owner didn't make sense together. And as he stood there, listening carefully, he realized the forest itself had gone quiet, unnaturally quiet, like it was waiting. The silence in the clearing deepened, pressing in around Rylan as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He stood still for several seconds, listening carefully, trying to separate normal forest sounds from something that felt out of place. Nothing moved, yet the absence of noise felt louder than anything he had heard earlier that afternoon on the trail. Rylan stepped slowly toward the tree line, his boots crunching lightly against the dry ground despite his effort to stay quiet. He scanned the area again, this time focusing on the spaces between the trees where shadows could easily hide movement or figures. The campsite behind him still felt active, like someone had just stepped away and could return at any moment without warning. He crouched near the edge of the clearing and examined the ground more closely, hoping to find any sign of direction. There were faint impressions this time, shallow marks leading away from the camp, almost invisible unless viewed at the right angle. The marks were inconsistent, as if whoever made them had been walking carefully or possibly trying not to leave a trail. Rylan followed the line slowly, taking cautious steps, keeping the campsite within view as long as possible behind him. After several meters, the trail became clearer, a narrow path bending slightly downhill toward a denser section of forest. He paused and spoke quietly into his radio again, updating his position and describing the direction of the tracks he was following. The voice on the other end acknowledged and advised him to proceed carefully, but not to stray too far without backup. Rylan agreed, though he already felt he had gone far enough to make turning back difficult without answers. The forest ahead looked darker, with thicker branches blocking out much of the remaining daylight filtering through the canopy. As he moved forward, the air seemed cooler, and the scent of smoke faded, replaced by the damp smell of soil and moss. Then he saw something ahead, a piece of fabric caught on a low branch, barely visible against the shadowed background. Rylan approached slowly and reached out, pulling the fabric free with a careful motion that didn't disturb the surrounding leaves. It was a torn strip from a jacket or shirt, still slightly damp, though he couldn't tell if it was from sweat or something else. He held it closer, inspecting the edges, which looked torn rather than cut, suggesting sudden movement or force. Rylan felt his chest tighten slightly, the situation no longer feeling like a simple case of someone stepping away from camp. He looked around again, turning in a slow circle, trying to sense if he was being watched from somewhere just out of sight. The same quiet pressed in around him, but now it felt heavier, like something hidden just beyond the limits of his vision. A sudden sound broke through the stillness, louder than before, the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping under weight. Rylan spun toward the noise instantly, raising his voice without thinking. "Hey, I know you're out there. This is a lookout officer. You need to respond right now." The words echoed through the trees, but again, no voice answered him, only the faint rustling of leaves settling back into place. His radio buzzed again, the dispatcher asking him to confirm what he had heard and whether he had visual contact. Rylan responded quickly, describing the sound and his current position, while keeping his eyes locked on the direction of the noise. He took a step forward, then another, moving toward where the branch had snapped, each movement more deliberate than the last. The ground sloped slightly downward, and the trees grew closer together, narrowing his field of view with every step. Then he saw it, something lying partially hidden behind a fallen log just ahead of him. At first, it looked like a bag or gear, but as he moved closer, the shape became more distinct and far more concerning. It was another backpack, similar in size to the one at the campsite, but this one was unzipped and partially emptied. Items were scattered around it, a flashlight, a map, and what looked like a small handheld camera lying on its side. Rylan knelt beside the pack and picked up the camera, noticing immediately that it was still powered on. The screen flickered faintly, displaying a paused recording, the last frame frozen in place as if waiting to be continued. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed the playback button, unsure of what he was about to see. The footage began with shaky movement. The camera pointed toward the campsite, capturing the same clearing he had just left behind. A voice could be heard in the recording, low and uneasy, speaking quickly as if trying to process something unexpected. "I don't know what that is, but it's been watching the camp for at least 10 minutes now." Rylan's grip tightened on the camera as the footage shifted suddenly, turning toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing. For a brief moment, something appeared between the trees, not clearly visible, but enough to suggest a figure standing still. Then the recording jolted violently, the camera dropping as the person holding it began to run. The sound of heavy breathing filled the audio, along with footsteps crashing through brush, moving fast and without direction. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black, without any clear conclusion or sign of what had happened next. Rylan lowered the camera slowly, his mind racing, trying to piece together what he had just witnessed. The warm campsite, the missing camper, the hidden trail, and now this recording all pointed to something far more serious. And as he knelt there in the quiet forest, one realization settled heavily in his thoughts. Whatever had been watching that campsite might still be out there, and it might now be watching him. Rylan stayed crouched beside the scattered gear, his eyes fixed on the dark space between the trees where the footage had pointed. The forest remained still, but now every shadow seemed deeper, every branch shaped into something that could move at any second. He placed the camera back into the open backpack, then stood slowly, keeping his movements controlled and deliberate to avoid noise. His radio buzzed again, the dispatcher asking for an update, their tone sharper now after the delay in his response. "I found a second pack." "And a recording," Rylan said, keeping his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "There may be someone else out here, and they were being followed," he added, choosing his words carefully as he scanned the area. The dispatcher paused briefly, then instructed him to return to the campsite and wait for additional personnel to arrive. Rylan hesitated for a moment, glancing deeper into the forest, then turned back, deciding it was the safest option. As he retraced his steps, the path felt longer than before, the quiet around him now carrying a constant sense of pressure. Each footstep sounded louder, and he found himself checking behind him more often than he wanted to admit. When he reached the clearing again, the campsite looked exactly as he had left it, unchanged and still eerily intact. The fire still held a faint glow, though weaker now, the warmth fading as time passed without anyone tending it. Rylan moved toward the center of the clearing and positioned himself where he could see all sides without obstruction. He unhooked his radio and kept it in his hand, ready to respond instantly if anything changed around him. Minutes passed slowly, stretching into something that felt much longer, as the daylight began to fade behind the trees. Then he heard it again, the same subtle movement from earlier, this time closer, circling the edge of the clearing. Rylan turned toward the sound, his posture tightening, his voice firm as he called out once more. "I know you're out there. You need to come into the open now," he said, his tone carrying both authority and urgency. For a moment, nothing happened, and he wondered if the sound had been nothing more than his imagination playing tricks. Then a figure stepped partially into view between two trees, just enough to break the line of shadow. It was a person, but something about the way they moved felt wrong, slow and uneven, like they were struggling to stay upright. Rylan took a cautious step forward, lowering his voice slightly. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help. You can come out," he said, trying to keep the situation calm. The figure shifted again, stepping further into the clearing, revealing torn clothing and dirt smeared across their arms and face. It was a man, roughly mid-30s, his expression distant, his eyes unfocused as if he had not fully returned from somewhere else. Rylan approached carefully, stopping a few steps away, keeping enough distance in case the man reacted unpredictably. "Are you alone out here? What happened?" Rylan asked, his voice steady but softer now. The man didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting past Rylan, scanning the trees behind him with quiet panic. "It doesn't stop watching," the man said finally, his voice hoarse and strained from exhaustion or fear. Rylan glanced over his shoulder instinctively, then looked back at the man. "Who doesn't stop watching?" he asked, trying to ground the conversation in something clear. The man shook his head slowly, as if the answer didn't fit into words he could explain. "It stays just far enough, never close, never gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Rylan felt the unease return stronger than before, but he pushed it aside, focusing on getting the man to safety. "You need to come with me. We're heading back up to the lookout station," Rylan said, extending a hand cautiously. The man stared at the offered hand for a moment, then reached out slowly, his movements hesitant but deliberate. As soon as their hands met, a loud crack echoed from the far side of the clearing, much closer than any sound before. Both of them turned instantly toward the noise, their attention locked on the dense trees where the sound had come from. For a brief second, Ryland thought he saw something move between the trunks, too large to be an animal, too fast to identify. The man tightened his grip suddenly, his voice shaking. "It knows you can see it now," he said, panic rising sharply in his tone. Ryland didn't respond, his focus shifting entirely to getting them out of the clearing as quickly as possible. He guided the man toward the trail, moving fast but controlled, not wanting to trip or lose direction in the fading light. Behind them, the forest remained quiet again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. They reached the trail and began the ascent back toward the lookout station, their pace steady despite the uneven ground. Ryland kept listening as they moved, expecting another sound, another sign, but nothing came. By the time they reached the ridge, the last light of day had almost disappeared, leaving the forest in deep shadow below. Rescue teams arrived later that evening, responding to Ryland's report and escorting both men safely back to base. The campsite was investigated the following day, along with the surrounding area where the second backpack had been found. According to the official report, no additional persons were located, and no signs of wildlife activity explained the events. The recording recovered from the camera was logged as evidence, though no clear figure could be confirmed in the footage. The man found in the clearing was treated for dehydration and shock, but he never gave a detailed account of what he saw. He repeated the same phrase in multiple interviews, always with the same quiet certainty that unsettled everyone involved. It stays just far enough, never close, never gone. Ryland returned to his post after several days, but he avoided that trail, choosing other routes for routine checks. He never spoke publicly about what he thought he saw between the trees that evening, or what he believed had been watching. But according to dispatch logs, one detail remained unchanged in every version of his report. The campsite had still been warm when he found it, as if whoever left had only just stepped away and was still nearby. The final voicemail from that roadside cabin, chilling truth on a cold stretch of rural highway, a voicemail surfaced that investigators later described as the last known trace of a missing man. The recording came from a roadside cabin that had no listed owner and no clear record of who stayed there. Garen Pike was 34 years old and worked as a freelance surveyor who spent most weeks mapping remote land parcels. He had taken a short contract near an unnamed county road, planning to finish measurements before the end of that week. Locals later said the area was quiet, mostly pine forest and old utility lines, with a single abandoned cabin near a gravel turnoff. Garen checked into a budget motel on Monday afternoon and told the front desk he would be out working late most days. His goal was simple: finish the survey, submit the data, and drive back home before the weekend traffic built up. On Tuesday morning, he drove his pickup along the county road, following faded markers left by a previous survey team. By early afternoon, his GPS logs showed he stopped near the gravel turnoff, roughly half a mile from the abandoned cabin. He sent a short text to a colleague, saying the signal was weak, but the site looked manageable for a quick job. Around 5 that evening, a nearby resident reported hearing a vehicle idle for an unusually long time near the tree line. The resident did not investigate, assuming it was a contractor finishing work, before heading back toward the highway. At 6:23, Garen made a phone call that lasted exactly 42 seconds, but no audio was recorded on the line. Call logs later confirmed the number dialed belonged to his own voicemail, triggered manually instead of through a missed call. Investigators would later focus on that detail because it suggested intent rather than a simple connection error. At 6:24, the voicemail began recording, capturing a low hum and faint wind pushing through what sounded like loose boards. Garen's voice came through clearly at first, steady but strained, as if he was trying to keep control of his breathing. He said, "If anyone hears this, I need this on record. Something is wrong out here, and I am not alone." There was a pause, followed by footsteps on what sounded like wooden flooring, each step uneven and slightly delayed. He continued, saying he had gone into the cabin to check for a higher vantage point, hoping to get a better signal. Inside, he claimed the air felt stale, and there were signs that someone had been there recently, despite its abandoned appearance. He described a chair pulled toward a window and a small table with what looked like fresh scratches across the surface. At that point, his voice dropped lower, and he said he could hear movement beneath the floor, slow and deliberate. The recording picked up a faint dragging sound, like something shifting across dirt or loose gravel directly under the structure. Garen whispered that he had tried to leave, but the door would not open fully, as if something heavy blocked it from outside. He said he had not heard any vehicle approach, and there were no visible tracks leading up to the cabin entrance. The wind grew louder in the recording, rattling the frame, while a second set of sounds began to overlap with his voice. It was unclear at first, but later analysis suggested a rhythmic tapping, uneven and too deliberate, to be caused by loose debris. Garen moved toward what he described as a hatch in the floor, partially hidden under a warped piece of plywood. He said he did not remember seeing it when he first entered, which raised questions about how long he had been inside. The recording captured him pulling the board aside, followed by a hollow echo that suggested a space larger than expected below. He hesitated, then said quietly that there was a light down there, faint but steady, not flickering like a natural source. At 6:26, his voice sharpened, and he said, "There is someone down there. I can see movement, and it is looking up." What followed was a sudden thud, as if something struck the underside of the floor with force, causing him to stumble backward. The voicemail continued, capturing heavy breathing and the sound of something scraping closer to the hatch opening. Garen tried the door again, his footsteps quick and uneven, but the handle rattled without giving way. He said he could feel the floor shifting slightly under his weight, like something below was pressing upward from beneath. The tapping returned, louder now, and closer to where he stood, matching a pattern that almost sounded intentional. At 6:27, the recording cut briefly, then resumed with a sharp intake of breath and a single word spoken clearly. He said, "It knows." The voicemail ended seconds later, leaving only the hollow sound of wind passing through the cabin walls. When Garen failed to return to the motel that night, the front desk noted his absence, but did not report it immediately. It was not until 2 days later, when his employer could not reach him, that authorities were contacted and a search began. Deputies followed his last known GPS point, leading them directly to the gravel turnoff and the abandoned cabin. They found his pickup parked at an angle near the trees, keys still inside, and no signs of a struggle in the immediate area. The cabin door stood slightly open when they arrived, with no visible obstruction preventing it from moving freely. Inside, the air was still, and the floor showed faint marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across the boards. Near the center of the room, they found a loose piece of plywood, partially covering a dark opening beneath the cabin. One of the deputies later reported a faint draft rising from below, carrying a smell that did not match the surrounding forest. The voicemail would be reviewed that evening, marking the first time anyone heard what Garen Pike experienced inside that cabin. Deputies secured the cabin that evening, documenting every visible detail before attempting to access the space beneath the floor. One officer used a crowbar to lift the plywood fully, revealing a narrow opening reinforced by old wooden beams. A faint draft continued to rise from below, carrying a damp, earthy smell that did not match the dry forest outside. They set up portable lights and lowered a camera first, recording what appeared to be a shallow crawl space. The footage showed packed soil, scattered debris, and what looked like impressions in the dirt that did not match animal tracks. Those impressions appeared elongated, almost like dragged lines, with irregular spacing that suggested uneven movement. After reviewing the footage, one deputy entered the opening, carefully lowering himself into the confined space below. He reported that the ground felt recently disturbed, softer in certain areas, as if something had been moving through it. About 2 meters in, he found a small object partially buried in the soil, which turned out to be Garen's phone. The device was still powered on, though the battery was low, and it showed the same voicemail call in its recent activity. There were no additional recordings saved, but metadata confirmed the exact timestamp matched the call logs already reviewed. Further inside, the deputy noted faint markings along the wooden supports, thin grooves carved at different heights. Those grooves did not form words or symbols, but their spacing appeared intentional, repeating in uneven intervals. When he reached the far end of the crawl space, he found something that forced him to stop and call for backup. There was a vertical drop cut into the earth, roughly 1 meter wide, descending beyond the reach of their initial lighting. The edges of the drop were reinforced with older wood, darker in color, suggesting it had been there far longer than the cabin above. A second camera was lowered into the opening, capturing a deeper shaft that extended into complete darkness. Audio from the camera picked up a faint echo, followed by a distant tapping sound that matched the pattern from the voicemail. At that point, the team withdrew and requested additional equipment, treating the location as a potential hazard zone. The next morning, investigators returned with proper gear, including stronger lights and breathing equipment for deeper entry. They documented the shaft more thoroughly, noting that its walls showed signs of manual digging rather than natural formation. Archived property records later revealed that the land had once been used for limited excavation in the early 1970s. However, no official record mentioned a shaft beneath the cabin, nor any structure that matched its current condition. As they prepared to descend, one investigator replayed the voicemail again, focusing on the moment Garin mentioned movement below. The timing aligned closely with when he would have been standing near the hatch, directly above the hidden opening. Investigators also noted the phrase he used near the end, interpreting it as a reaction rather than a random statement. Before lowering anyone further, they conducted a sound test, dropping a small object down the shaft to measure depth. The object struck something after several seconds, followed by a hollow echo that suggested a larger space below. Moments later, a faint tapping sound responded from within the darkness, repeating the same uneven rhythm captured earlier. That response was recorded on multiple devices, confirming it was not a playback artifact or environmental interference. At that point, the team halted the descent, shifting focus to understanding whether the sound indicated structural instability or something else. Back at the cabin level, another deputy re-examined the floorboards, noticing slight warping near where Garin had reportedly stood. The wood showed pressure marks from below, consistent with upward force applied repeatedly over a short period of time. No clear explanation was found for that pressure, and no mechanical source was identified in or around the cabin. As the investigation continued, attention returned to the voicemail, specifically the final seconds before it ended abruptly. Audio specialists enhanced the recording, isolating background noise that had not been clear during initial playback. Within that segment, they detected a second voice, extremely faint, layered beneath the sound of wind and movement. The voice did not form complete words, but its cadence matched the tapping pattern heard both in the cabin and the shaft. That detail shifted the direction of the investigation, raising new questions about what Garin Pike encountered in that roadside cabin. By the third day, investigators shifted their focus from recovery to understanding what the shaft beneath the cabin actually was. They brought in a geological consultant who examined the soil composition and the structure of the vertical drop. His report suggested the shaft had been expanded over time, not in a single effort, with tool marks from different periods. That detail aligned with archived records from the early 1970s, but also hinted at more recent activity below. Despite the risks, a controlled descent was approved, using a harness system and continuous audio monitoring from above. The first investigator lowered into the shaft, moved slowly, calling out observations as he passed the reinforced sections. About 4 meters down, the walls widened slightly, revealing a chamber carved into the earth with uneven edges. His light swept across the space, illuminating scattered objects that appeared out of place in such an isolated location. There were fragments of wood, rusted metal pieces, and what looked like remnants of old tools partially buried in dirt. Then his voice changed, tightening as he described something positioned near the far side of the chamber. He said there was a vertical support beam, and beside it, markings carved into the surface at irregular intervals. Those markings resembled the grooves found in the crawl space above, but they were deeper and more numerous. As he moved closer, he paused, then reported finding fabric caught along the base of the beam. The fabric was later confirmed to match the material of Garin Pike's jacket, which he had been wearing that day. There were no signs of a struggle in the chamber, no scattered footprints beyond the initial entry path, but the soil near the beam showed compression, as if weight had been applied there repeatedly over a short time. While documenting the area, the investigator's audio feed picked up a faint tapping sound echoing from deeper within the earth. He stopped speaking for a moment, then said the sound was not coming from above, but from a lower point beyond the chamber. A second shaft was discovered behind the beam, narrower and partially concealed by loose soil and debris. This shaft descended further than the first, disappearing beyond the reach of their strongest light. The tapping continued, steady and uneven, matching the exact pattern recorded in the voicemail and earlier tests. At that point, the team above instructed him to withdraw, prioritizing safety over further exploration. As he began ascending, the tapping grew louder, no longer distant, but resonating through the walls around him. He reported feeling vibrations through the harness line, subtle at first, then stronger with each repeated sound. Halfway up, his audio feed captured something new, a faint voice layered within the tapping rhythm. The words were unclear, but the cadence matched the enhanced segment from Garen's final voicemail. When the investigator reached the surface, the team immediately sealed the opening, ending all descent operations. The site was classified as unstable, and further access was restricted pending a full structural assessment. Garen Pike was never recovered, and no definitive conclusion was reached regarding what happened inside that cabin. His phone remained the only direct record preserved as evidence, along with the enhanced audio analysis. Weeks later, one of the technicians reviewing the case revisited the voicemail using updated filtering software. He isolated the final seconds again, focusing on the layered voice beneath the tapping pattern. This time, the audio resolved more clearly, revealing a phrase repeated in a low, uneven tone. It said, "Not alone down here," followed by a pause, then the same phrase spoken again with slight variation. The technician noted that the second repetition did not match Garen's voice profile based on earlier recordings. That distinction raised a final question that remained unanswered in the official report. If the second voice was not Garen Pike, then something else had been speaking from beneath that roadside cabin. The case file was eventually closed without resolution, marked as an unexplained disappearance with unusual environmental factors. Years later, the cabin no longer stands, removed after structural concerns made the area unsafe for any further investigation. But the voicemail still circulates in archived files, often cited as one of the clearest recordings tied to a missing person case. And in that recording, just before the line goes silent, the tapping stops for a brief moment. In that silence, a voice can be heard, closer than before, repeating the same words as if answering his call. One line in the dispatch log changed the case. The case would later be defined by a single sentence typed during a quiet overnight shift. At the time, it looked like nothing more than routine documentation from a call that felt ordinary. The call came in just after 12:30 in the morning, when the county usually went silent. Maribel Crane had been a dispatcher for nearly 13 years, and she trusted patterns more than instincts. Most serious emergencies announce themselves clearly, with panic, noise, and urgency spilling through the line. This call did not. The man who called sounded winded but controlled, like someone trying to sound calm on purpose. He said he was driving home when his headlights caught a pickup truck down in a roadside ditch. The vehicle sat nose forward at an odd angle, with no lights on and no movement inside. Maribel asked for his location, and he hesitated before answering. He gave a mile marker, then corrected himself, then mentioned a service road nearby. She typed carefully, noting the changes without commenting on them. He said he walked up to the truck and looked through the driver's window. There was blood on the steering wheel, dark and dried in places. The driver was slumped forward, seatbelt on, and not responding. Maribel asked if he had checked for breathing. The man said no, he did not want to touch anything. His voice tightened slightly when he said it, then smoothed out again. She dispatched a patrol unit and volunteer medics, classifying the call as a single vehicle accident. As she worked through the checklist, she kept listening to the background noise on the line. There was wind, distant traffic, and nothing else. Just before hanging up, the man added something she had not asked about. He said the crash must have happened hours earlier because nobody else was around. Maribel paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She asked him why he thought the crash was old. The man hesitated, then said the truck just looked like it had been there a while. That answer felt thin, but not thin enough to challenge. Maribel asked one more question, keeping her tone neutral. She asked if the engine felt cold. The man said no, the engine was warm. There was a brief silence after that, the kind that lingered longer than expected. Maribel typed as he spoke, documenting the contradiction without comment. Caller reports engine warm despite belief crash occurred hours earlier. She closed the call and moved on, already answering another line. In her experience, small inconsistencies were common and usually meaningless. 11 minutes later, Deputy Alric Boone arrived at the scene. He was nearing the end of a long shift and hoped for a quick resolution. What he saw matched the report closely enough to satisfy him. The driver was identified as Roland Ives, age 46, a local mechanic. He was slumped forward in the seat with a visible head wound near his hairline. There were no skid marks, no broken signs, and no debris scattered across the road. The medic confirmed death at the scene, estimating it had occurred sometime earlier. With no obvious signs of foul play, the incident was logged as non-suspicious. The truck was towed, photos were taken, and traffic flowed again. By sunrise, the case was already settling into paperwork. It looked like another lonely death on a forgotten stretch of road. No witnesses, no clear cause, and no reason to look twice. Maribel returned for her next shift that night and barely remembered the call. The dispatch log remained unchanged, one line sitting quietly among dozens of others. 2 days later, that line would be read again, and nothing would be routine after that. 2 days after the crash, the file reached an investigator who did not trust summaries. Halden Pierce was 51, methodical, and known for rereading what others skimmed once. He believed most mistakes lived in margins, timestamps, and sentences people assumed were harmless. He read the report front to back, then opened the dispatch log. That was where he stopped. The line about the warm engine did not fit the timeline at all. If the crash happened hours earlier, the engine should have been cold. If the engine was warm, then the crash was recent or the truck was run afterward. Either option meant the initial conclusion was wrong. Halden requested the tow yard intake notes before doing anything else. The operator had written that the hood felt warm when he hooked the truck. He also noted the radio was playing a local station that signed off overnight. That detail mattered. The station stopped broadcasting just after midnight. If the radio was still on, the truck had been running not long before discovery. Halden pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest working intersection. It was miles away, grainy, and rarely useful, but he checked anyway. He found a pickup matching the truck passing through 20 minutes before the call. That erased the idea of a crash sitting unnoticed for hours. Someone had either been mistaken or someone had lied. Halden reclassified the case and requested the original caller information. The name was Keaton Rule, age 32, a local delivery driver. His record included minor theft and a previous false report years earlier. Halden brought Keaton in for a follow-up interview. Keaton appeared cooperative, but his answers drifted under pressure. He repeated the story, then adjusted small details without noticing. He said he was driving home, then later said he was heading out. He said the truck looked abandoned, then said he could see fresh blood. When asked about the engine, he avoided eye contact. Halden asked him directly why he believed the crash was old. Keaton said it was just a feeling, nothing specific. That answer did not survive silence. Phone records placed Keaton near the area earlier that night. They also showed his emergency call came from several miles away. That explained why nobody saw him at the scene. While Halden waited on more records, the autopsy report arrived. The medical examiner noted blunt force trauma inconsistent with a steering wheel impact. The wound suggested a heavy object, delivered with force from close range. Halden visited Roland Ives' garage the same afternoon. The place was orderly, with tools aligned and labeled. One space on the wall was empty, the outline of a tire iron visible in dust. Oil stains on the floor showed a recent vehicle movement. The pattern suggested the truck had been driven after an abrupt stop. It looked less like an accident and more like cleanup. Halden brought Keaton back in for a second interview. This time, the tone changed. Halden laid out the timeline slowly, one piece at a time. The warm engine, the radio station, the camera footage, the missing tool. Keaton listened, nodding, breathing shallow, saying nothing. When Halden finished, he slid the dispatch log across the table. He pointed to the single line typed by a dispatcher he had never met. Halden asked Keaton if the engine was warm because he had just shut it off. Keaton swallowed hard and stared at the table. He did not answer. The room stayed quiet longer than most people could tolerate. When Keaton finally looked up, his face had changed, and Halden knew the case was about to break open. Keaton broke the silence by asking for water, then pushed the cup away without drinking. His shoulders slumped, as if he had been holding himself upright by force alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and steadier than Halden expected. He said he knew Roland and that they had known each other for years. They had worked together briefly at a repair shop before money ruined the friendship. Roland had accused him of stealing tools, and the argument never fully died. On the night of the crash, Keaton went to Roland's garage to confront him. He claimed he only wanted to talk, but the discussion turned heated quickly. Words turned into shouting, and shouting turned into something neither planned. Keaton said Roland grabbed a tire iron from the wall, not to swing it, but to threaten him. Keaton reacted without thinking, striking first and harder than he realized. Roland fell backward, hit his head, and did not get back up. Keaton said he panicked when he realized Roland was not moving. He checked for breathing, found none, and felt the weight of what he had done. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision he thought would save him. He dragged Roland into the truck, buckled him in, and wiped down the garage floor. He drove the truck out to the highway, choosing a spot he thought looked accidental. He eased it into the ditch, careful not to leave skid marks. He left the engine running longer than intended, then shut it off and walked away. After driving several miles, he called emergency services and pretended to discover the crash. He believed distance would erase connection and time would erase doubt. What he did not consider was habit. He did not consider a dispatcher trained to document contradictions without judgment. He did not consider how machines recorded things people forgot. The confession aligned cleanly with the evidence already gathered. Phone records, camera footage, tool placement, and injury patterns matched his account. The case moved quickly once the story stopped changing. Keaton was charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering. He accepted a plea agreement months later, avoiding trial and a longer sentence. The final paperwork was sealed, and the case faded from public attention. Maribel Crane learned about the outcome through an internal bulletin. Her name was not mentioned, and her note was not highlighted. To her, it was just another closed call from years earlier. She continued working nights, answering phones, and typing details others overlooked. She never asked what happened to the cases that passed through her hands. She only believed that accuracy mattered even when nobody seemed to notice. Halden Pierce retired several years later. When asked about cases that stayed with him, he mentioned this one quietly. He said the truth often hides inside sentences people rush past. The crash was never what it appeared to be. It was not solved by a dramatic discovery or a single bold move. It was solved because one line did not match the story it belonged to. Long after the files were archived, that line remained unchanged. A simple observation typed during a quiet shift. One line in the dispatch log that changed the case. The night guard who found a camera still recording. The camera had been recording for nearly 7 hours when the night guard finally noticed the small red light. By the time anyone reviewed the footage, investigators would say the recording explained almost everything that happened that night. Calder Vance was 38 years old and worked the overnight security shift at a quiet industrial storage complex outside town. The job mostly involved slow patrols through empty corridors while forklifts and shipping crates slept under dim warehouse lighting. Calder preferred the silence because it made the hours pass easily without supervisors asking questions or coworkers starting pointless conversations. The storage complex belonged to a logistics company that handled overflow inventory from several regional retailers during busy shipping seasons. Most units held sealed pallets of furniture or boxed electronics waiting for transport trucks scheduled during the early morning hours. On that particular Thursday night, the facility felt unusually still, even compared with the normal quiet Calder experienced every shift. The weather outside had turned cold and dry, which caused the metal siding along the warehouses to creak softly. Calder completed his first patrol just after 1 in the morning and returned to the security office near the loading docks. Inside the office, he watched the row of surveillance monitors that displayed every hallway, gate entrance, and warehouse aisle. Nothing moved on any screen except the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights reflecting off polished concrete floors. About 20 minutes later, Calder noticed something strange on one of the interior camera feeds from Warehouse 4. The image showed a small portable camera resting on top of a wooden crate near the center aisle. At first, Calder assumed a worker from the previous shift had accidentally left personal equipment behind during evening inventory checks. The strange part was the blinking red recording light that flashed steadily toward the ceiling above the crate. Calder leaned closer to the monitor because portable cameras were not allowed anywhere inside the storage complex. Company policy prohibited photography due to confidential inventory contracts with several private retail partners across the region. Calder rewound the feed a few minutes through the digital recording system, expecting to see someone placing the device. Instead, the footage showed the camera sitting on the crate exactly the same way for hours. The system log confirmed the camera first appeared shortly before 7 that evening during the final hour of daytime operations. No employee report mentioned filming or photography inside Warehouse 4 during the shift change earlier that night. Calder grabbed a flashlight and radio before leaving the office to investigate the strange object himself. The walk across the dark loading dock felt longer than usual as cold air drifted through the large delivery doors. When Calder reached the metal entrance to Warehouse 4, he noticed the door was already unlocked. That detail alone was unusual because the night protocol required every interior warehouse door to remain locked after 10. Calder pushed the door open slowly and stepped into the wide storage space filled with stacked crates and silent forklifts. The only light came from overhead fixtures that cast long shadows between aisles of wrapped pallets. About 30 yards ahead, Calder could see the small camera sitting exactly where the monitor showed. Its red recording light blinked steadily in the quiet warehouse as if waiting for someone to finally notice it. Calder approached cautiously because something about the scene felt staged rather than accidental. He lifted the camera carefully from the crate and noticed the lens pointed directly toward the warehouse entrance behind him. Calder frowned and spoke quietly into his radio, asking if anyone from management authorized recording equipment inside the building. The dispatcher answered after a moment and said no filming permits had been issued for the property that night. Calder turned the camera around in his hands and realized the recording timer was still running. 7 hours and 16 minutes appeared on the small digital display beneath the blinking light. That meant the device started filming long before Calder arrived for his overnight shift. He considered shutting the camera off, but curiosity stopped him for a moment longer. Calder pressed the playback button to review the beginning of the footage while standing beside the crate. The screen flickered once before showing the same warehouse aisle earlier that evening. For several minutes, nothing happened in the recording except workers finishing their final tasks before leaving the building. Then, the camera view suddenly shifted as someone stepped into frame and placed the device on the crate. The person wore a dark hooded jacket that hid most facial details from the camera lens. However, one important detail became clear immediately when the figure looked directly into the recording. The person knew exactly where Calder would eventually stand. Calder stood beside the crate and watched the footage again, holding the small camera close to his face. The hooded figure remained in the frame for several seconds after placing the device carefully on the wooden surface. The person adjusted the camera angle slowly until the warehouse entrance filled the center of the screen. For a moment, the figure looked straight into the lens, as if checking whether the framing was correct. Then the person raised one hand and pointed directly toward the doorway where Calder now stood. The gesture felt deliberate and unsettling because the camera had been aimed exactly at that position. Calder felt a slow, chill run across his shoulders while the recording continued to play quietly in his hands. The hooded figure finally stepped backward and walked down the main aisle between tall stacks of sealed crates. Within seconds, the person disappeared into the darker section near the rear loading doors. For several hours, nothing happened on the recording except silent warehouse lights flickering above empty concrete floors. Calder tapped the fast-forward button until movement appeared again near the far end of the building. The timestamp now showed 11:43 in the evening, according to the digital display on screen. A rear loading door opened slowly, and a man stepped inside carrying a dark duffel bag over one shoulder. The man moved carefully along the aisle while glancing behind him several times. Calder leaned closer to the screen when the stranger finally crossed in front of the camera lens. Under the overhead lighting, his face became visible for a brief but clear moment. Calder immediately recognized the man as Darian Salt, a part-time forklift operator from the afternoon crew. Darian normally finished work around 6 in the evening and never stayed inside the complex after shift hours. The recording showed Darian placing the duffel bag on the floor beside the crate holding the camera. He began opening several sealed cartons stacked nearby, each one filled with newly delivered electronic tablets. Darian worked quickly while pulling the expensive devices from the boxes and sliding them into the duffel bag. Every few seconds, he paused and looked toward the warehouse entrance as if listening for approaching footsteps. The camera captured everything clearly from its position on top of the crate. Within 10 minutes, the duffel bag was already half full with stolen tablets removed from several cartons. Darian resealed the boxes carefully and pushed them back into place among the surrounding pallets. The recording continued as he lifted the heavy bag and prepared to leave the warehouse the same way he entered. Just before walking away, Darian noticed something that stopped him suddenly in the center aisle. His eyes moved slowly toward the small camera, resting only a few feet away. For the first time, he seemed to notice the blinking red recording light. Darian stepped closer and leaned down toward the lens with a confused expression on his face. Calder watched the screen closely as Darian studied the device in silence for several seconds. The man looked around the empty warehouse once more before focusing on the camera again. Then he leaned closer to the microphone and whispered something quietly that the recording barely captured. Calder raised the small camera closer to his ear and replayed the final seconds of the recording several times. The warehouse around him remained silent, except for the faint sound coming from the camera speaker. Darian's face filled the screen while he leaned closer to the lens with a tense expression. For several seconds, he studied the device as if trying to understand why it was there. Then he looked directly into the lens and whispered a short sentence toward the microphone. The audio sounded weak and distorted, but the words slowly became clear after Calder replayed the clip again. Darian said, "Someone already knows you will watch this." After speaking those words, he lifted the duffel bag from the floor and stepped away from the crate. The recording showed him walking quickly down the aisle toward the rear loading doors. Within seconds, he disappeared through the doorway and the warehouse became empty again. The camera continued recording for several more hours without capturing any additional movement. Calder stood quietly beside the crate while the red recording light blinked in the dim warehouse lighting. Something about the message made him uneasy because Darian sounded genuinely frightened rather than confident. Calder returned to the security office and reported the entire situation through the company dispatch line. Management contacted local investigators before the morning shift arrived at the facility later that day. Detectives collected the camera along with the security recordings from the building surveillance system. Those recordings confirmed that Darian Salt entered the warehouse shortly before midnight through the rear loading doors. They also confirmed that he never passed through the front security gate after leaving the building. Police searched Darian's apartment 3 days later and recovered most of the stolen electronic tablets. However, Darian himself was not there, and investigators could not determine where he went after that night. The small portable camera remained the most unusual piece of evidence recovered from the warehouse. No fingerprints were found on the device except Calder and Darian from when they handled it. Security footage from earlier that evening showed nothing, clearly identifying the hooded figure who placed the camera. Investigators believed the person entered the building during the busy final hour of daytime operations. That was the only time the facility allowed outside delivery drivers and temporary contractors inside the warehouse. Even after reviewing every available recording, no one could identify the individual who set the camera on the crate. What puzzled detectives most was the way the device had been positioned toward the entrance. It was placed exactly where Calder would stand hours later while reviewing the strange recording. The message Darian whispered into the lens also raised questions that investigators never fully answered. "Someone already knows you will watch this." Calder often remembered those words during later night shifts when the warehouses felt unusually quiet. The red recording light had blinked patiently for hours as if waiting for the right moment. And when Calder finally found the camera still recording, it already knew exactly who would watch the footage. A bus driver picked up a passenger who wasn't on any route. Ryland Cade had been driving the same late-night bus route through the outer industrial district for nearly 11 quiet years. Most nights felt identical, with empty streets, flickering traffic lights, and the low mechanical hum of the aging city bus. Ryland was 38 years old, a former delivery driver who preferred quiet work where nobody asked many questions. His shift always started just before midnight, when the last commuters disappeared and the city slowly folded into silence. That particular night began the same way, with light rain tapping against the windshield as Rylan steered through deserted intersections. The route was simple and predictable, a wide loop connecting an old factory zone with 3 quiet residential blocks. According to the printed schedule, the bus stopped at exactly 14 designated stops before returning to the central depot. Rylan knew every one of those stops from memory, including the broken bench near the freight yard and the empty lot beside Arden Street. Around 1:15 in the morning, the bus rolled past the final scheduled stop, which meant the next destination was the depot. The streets beyond that point were not part of any official route, and the company rarely sent buses there after midnight. Rylan eased his foot off the accelerator when he noticed a lone figure standing under a dim street lamp ahead. The man stood completely still beside the curb, his shoulders hunched slightly as rain drifted through the weak yellow light. At first, Rylan assumed the stranger was waiting for a taxi or simply sheltering from the weather. Still, the man raised one arm slowly, the universal signal people used when they wanted a bus to stop. Rylan frowned at the empty sidewalk around him because that intersection had never been listed on any company route. He checked the dashboard schedule again, even though he already knew that stop did not exist on the official map. The man remained motionless beside the road, watching the approaching bus with an expression that seemed calm and strangely patient. For reasons Rylan could not fully explain, he felt a quiet pressure to slow the vehicle. The bus hissed softly as the brakes engaged, and the folding doors opened with their usual mechanical sigh. The passenger stepped aboard without hesitation, bringing with him the cold smell of rain and damp pavement. He looked to be somewhere in his late 40s, wearing a dark coat that appeared several decades out of style. Rylan offered the routine greeting he used for every rider, keeping his voice relaxed despite the unusual stop. "Evening. Fare is $2. The man nodded once and placed 2 wrinkled bills into the fare box without speaking another word. Rylan noticed the passenger did not ask about the route or mention any destination. Instead, the man walked quietly toward the back and chose a seat beside the window near the last row. The bus pulled away from the curb again, its headlights sweeping across the empty warehouses lining the street. Rylan checked the interior mirror briefly, expecting to see the passenger settling into his seat. The man was staring straight ahead, not out the window, but toward the front of the bus. His expression looked distant, almost thoughtful, like someone replaying a memory that refused to fade. A few minutes passed as the bus continued toward the depot, rain tapping steadily against the glass. Then Rylan noticed something strange printed across the top of the passenger transfer slip. Every transfer ticket carried the current date automatically stamped by the machine inside the fare box. This ticket showed a date written in faded ink that read October 1993. Rylan blinked once and leaned closer to the dashboard mirror, trying to make sure he had read it correctly. The passenger still sat in the same seat, calm and silent, holding the small paper ticket between his fingers. Rylan felt a slow tightening in his chest as another thought quietly surfaced in his mind. The company had not even operated a night route through this district in October 1993. And according to the old depot records, the last driver assigned to that abandoned route had vanished during a shift that same year. Rylan Cade kept one hand on the steering wheel while his eyes returned to the mirror above the windshield. The passenger still sat near the back, holding the transfer ticket while staring toward the front of the bus. Rylan tried to convince himself that the strange date must be a printing error from the aging fare machine. The buses assigned to late shifts were older models, and their ticket printers occasionally jammed or stamped faded numbers. Still, the number on that paper looked clear and deliberate, October 1993, printed across the top line. Rylan glanced again at the quiet street ahead as the bus rolled toward the depot entrance. A narrow service road cut through the warehouse district before connecting to the main avenue near the company yard. Normally, Rylan would drive straight there, park the bus, and hand the vehicle to the maintenance crew. But something about the passenger in the back seat made him hesitate before turning toward the depot. He checked the mirror again and saw the man now looking out the rain-covered window. The passenger suddenly spoke, his voice calm but slightly hoarse from the long silence. "You passed my stop!" Rylan blinked in surprise and shifted slightly in his seat. "There are no more stops tonight," Rylan replied carefully. The route ended back on Arden Street. The man slowly turned his head toward the front of the bus. His eyes looked tired but focused, as if he already knew what the driver would say. "There used to be another stop," the passenger said quietly. Rylan felt a chill crawl along his arms, despite the warm air blowing from the heater vents. "What stop?" he asked. "The bridge stop," the man answered. Rylan searched his memory and frowned. There was a narrow rail bridge 2 miles away, but the company had removed that stop decades earlier. According to the older drivers at the depot, the bridge stop disappeared after a strange incident in the early 1990s. Rylan had only heard the story once during a break room conversation years earlier. A driver working the late shift reportedly radioed dispatch about a passenger who never exited the bus. When the vehicle finally returned to the depot, the driver was gone and the bus sat empty. No signs of struggle were ever reported, and the company quietly shut down that section of the route. Rylan swallowed slowly as the rain continued tapping against the windshield. "The bridge stop closed a long time ago," he said carefully. The passenger leaned slightly forward in his seat. "I know," the man replied. For a moment, the bus filled only with the sound of the engine and the steady rhythm of rain. Rylan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Where exactly do you need to go?" he asked. The passenger lifted the transfer ticket again, studying the faded ink as though confirming something important. "The route always continued past the bridge," the man said quietly. Rylan felt a growing unease settle into the pit of his stomach. The passenger spoke about the old route as if he had ridden it many times before, but no one had traveled that line for over 30 years. Rylan glanced at the digital clock above the dashboard. It read 1:27 in the morning. That time felt strangely familiar, though he could not immediately remember why. Then the memory surfaced slowly from the conversation he once overheard in the depot break room. The missing driver from 1993 had radioed dispatch at exactly 1:27. Rylan felt his pulse quicken as the road curved toward the depot entrance ahead. If he continued straight, the shift would end in less than 3 minutes. But the passenger in the mirror was now watching him again. His expression looked calm, almost patient, as if waiting for Rylan to make a choice. Then the man spoke one final sentence. "The bridge stop is still there," he said softly. "You just have to drive the old road to see it." Rylan Cade slowed the bus as the depot entrance appeared on the right side of the road. The security gate stood open, glowing under a row of bright white lamps that cut through the steady rain. All he had to do was turn the wheel slightly, and the shift would end like every other quiet night. But the passenger's words echoed in his mind with unsettling clarity. "The bridge stop is still there." Rylan glanced at the mirror again. The man in the back seat watched him calmly, holding the old transfer ticket between two steady fingers. Something about the situation felt strangely deliberate, like a moment that had already happened before. Rylan exhaled slowly and drove past the depot entrance without turning. The narrow service road continued straight into the darker section of the industrial district. Streetlights became sparse as the bus moved farther from the main avenue. After several minutes, the warehouses disappeared, replaced by thick trees growing along an abandoned rail line. The road ahead curved toward a narrow steel bridge that crossed a shallow river. Rylan had never driven this part of the district during his 11 years on the job. Yet the passenger behind him seemed completely certain about where the road would lead. Rain drummed steadily on the bus roof as the headlights illuminated the old bridge structure. The metal frame looked rusted and worn, barely visible beyond the mist rising from the river. Then Rylan noticed something unexpected beside the road. A bus stop sign stood near the entrance of the bridge. The metal pole leaned slightly to one side, and the faded transit logo barely showed through layers of peeling paint. Rylan felt his chest tighten as the bus rolled closer. The stop looked abandoned for decades, yet it still stood exactly where the passenger described. Without speaking, Rylan pressed the brake pedal and the bus slowed beside the sign. The doors opened with their usual mechanical hiss. For a moment, neither man moved. Then the passenger stood and walked slowly toward the front. The bus floor creaked softly beneath his shoes. When he reached the driver's seat, he paused beside Rylan. Up close, the man looked older than Rylan first believed, his face lined with quiet exhaustion. But his expression carried a strange sense of relief. "Thank you for coming back," the passenger said calmly. Rylan frowned slightly. "What do you mean, coming back?" The man studied the driver for a moment before answering. "Drivers stopped coming this way after that night," he explained quietly. Rylan felt a cold wave move through his body. "What night?" he asked. The passenger held up the transfer ticket again. "The night the last bus arrived here," he said. Rylan's eyes drifted toward the faded date printed across the small piece of paper. October 1993. The same date from the old story he once heard inside the depot break room. Rylan looked back at the passenger. You were on that bus? The man nodded slowly. There were two of us, he replied. The driver and the last passenger. Rylan waited for the rest of the explanation, but the man simply turned toward the open doors. Rain drifted softly through the entrance as the river moved quietly beneath the bridge. The passenger stepped down onto the wet pavement. Then he paused beside the door and looked back at Rylan one final time. The driver never finished the route, the man said. He never brought the passenger to the bridge stop. Rylan felt the meaning of those words settle slowly into place. You waited all this time, he said quietly. The passenger gave a small nod. Then he stepped away from the bus and walked toward the dark bridge. Within seconds, his figure disappeared into the mist hanging above the river. Rylan remained frozen behind the wheel, listening to the rain and the steady hum of the engine. After a moment, he reached forward and closed the doors. The bus pulled away from the old stop and turned back toward the distant depot lights. When Rylan finally parked inside the yard, the night supervisor approached the vehicle with a clipboard. You ran a little late tonight, the supervisor said casually. Rylan hesitated before answering. There was a passenger, he explained. The supervisor frowned slightly. That is strange, he replied. This route has been empty all night. Rylan looked down at the fare box beside his seat. Inside the clear plastic tray lay 2 wrinkled dollar bills and a single transfer ticket. The paper still showed the faded date from October 1993. Rylan never saw the passenger again. But every late shift after that night, he slowed slightly whenever the road curved toward the old bridge. Because sometimes, just before 1:27 in the morning, he thought he could see someone standing beside that forgotten bus stop. A hiker found a warning carved into the canyon wall. In late autumn of 2017, a lone hiker discovered a warning carved deep into a canyon wall. By the time investigators understood what it meant, several strange details from that day had already become impossible to explain. Ronan Hale was 34 years old and worked long night shifts as a freight supervisor at a regional distribution warehouse. On most weekends, he drove away from the city, looking for quiet trails where he could hike alone and clear his mind. That Saturday morning, he headed toward a remote stretch of canyonland several hours outside the nearest town. The place was known to locals for steep walls, narrow paths, and long sections where cell signals simply disappeared. Ronan preferred trails that few people visited because crowded parks always made the experience feel rushed and noisy. According to later interviews, he packed water, a small camera, trail snacks, and a folded topographic map inside his worn hiking bag. The trail he chose that day followed a dry riverbed before bending into a deeper section of canyon. By mid-morning, the sun hung high above the cliffs, casting sharp shadows that stretched across the dusty stone floor. At first, nothing unusual happened, and Ronan walked steadily while taking photos of unusual rock formations along the path. Around noon, the canyon narrowed sharply, forcing the trail close to a tall wall of pale stone. It was there that Ronan noticed something strange, cut into the rock several feet above the ground. At first, he assumed it was graffiti left by climbers, which sometimes appeared in isolated places like this. But when he stepped closer, the markings looked older and far more deliberate than simple carved initials. The letters were deep and uneven, like someone had spent a long time pressing a sharp tool into hard stone. Ronan brushed dust away with his hand and read the words slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. The message was short, only a single sentence carved into the canyon wall. It read, "Do not go farther. Turn back while you still can." At first, Ronan laughed quietly to himself, assuming the message was some kind of dramatic joke left by hikers. But something about the carving felt different, because the stone around the letters looked weathered and very old. The grooves held darker sediment that had settled over many seasons of rain and wind. It suggested the warning had been there much longer than the average trail marker or tourist graffiti. Ronan took several photos of the carving with his small camera before stepping back to examine the surrounding rock. There were no signatures, no dates, and no other markings nearby that explained who might have written the message. The trail continued deeper into the canyon, only a few yards past the carved warning. From where Ronan stood, the path curved slightly and disappeared behind a sharp bend in the stone walls. He checked his watch and considered turning around, mostly because the warning had unsettled him more than he expected. Still, curiosity pushed him forward, and the idea of a mysterious carving made the hike suddenly more interesting. Before continuing, Ronan scanned the ground carefully for footprints or signs of recent visitors passing through the narrow corridor. The dust looked mostly undisturbed, except for faint animal tracks weaving between scattered rocks along the canyon floor. No fresh boot prints appeared anywhere near the carved warning. That detail would later become one of the first things investigators wrote down in their notes. Ronan hesitated for another moment before lifting his camera again and recording a short video of the strange message. In the footage, his voice sounded calm, though later listeners noticed a hint of uncertainty in his tone. He quietly read the carved sentence aloud and joked that someone out there probably had a strange sense of humor. Then he turned the camera toward the trail ahead and began walking deeper into the canyon. For the next several minutes, the path remained silent, except for the steady sound of Ronan's boots against loose gravel. The canyon walls grew taller as he continued, blocking more sunlight and lowering the temperature noticeably. According to the timestamp on his camera footage, about 12 minutes passed after he left the carved warning behind. That was when Ronan stopped walking again and aimed the camera towards something farther ahead along the trail. At first, the video captured only stone and shadow, but then a shape slowly appeared near the base of the canyon wall. It looked like another carving, larger this time, etched into a darker section of rock several yards ahead. Ronan moved closer to read it clearly, unaware that the second message would soon make the first warning seem far less mysterious. Ronan Hale approached the darker section of stone with slow steps, holding the camera steady as he moved closer. The second carving was much larger than the first message he had discovered earlier along the narrow canyon trail. Unlike the first warning, this carving stretched across several feet of rock and looked hurried, almost desperate in appearance. The letters were uneven and deeper in some places, suggesting whoever carved them had worked quickly under pressure. Ronan stepped closer and wiped loose sand from the grooves with the side of his hand. The words slowly became clear as the dust fell away from the surface of the rock. The message read, "If you see this, someone ignored the first warning." For several seconds, Ronan said nothing, while the camera quietly recorded the carved sentence in sharp afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than before, and the casual tone from earlier had disappeared. He muttered that the place suddenly felt less like a hiking trail and more like the beginning of a strange story. Still, he continued walking slowly toward the bend in the canyon where the path narrowed even further. Investigators would later review the camera footage many times while studying the sequence of events from that afternoon. At first, nothing unusual appeared beyond the two carved warnings and Ronan's calm but cautious reactions. But a few minutes after passing the second carving, something else entered the frame briefly near the canyon floor. The camera caught a glimpse of what looked like a rusted metal object, partly buried under layers of dust. Ronan noticed it immediately and crouched down to brush away loose gravel from the small exposed corner. As he cleared more dirt, the shape slowly revealed itself as a narrow metal box. The box looked old and heavily weathered, with one side bent inward as if something heavy had struck it years earlier. Ronan turned the camera toward it while carefully lifting the lid, which opened with a dry scraping sound. Inside the box were several folded papers wrapped in a thin plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. There was also a small flashlight and what appeared to be an old cassette tape. Ronan pulled the papers out first and unfolded them while kneeling in the dust beside the canyon wall. The camera footage shook slightly as he adjusted his position to read the faded writing. The pages contained handwritten notes filled with rough sketches of the canyon and short lines of hurried instructions. One sentence appeared several times across the pages, written in thicker ink than the rest. It said, "Stay out of the narrow passage after the second bend." Ronan glanced up toward the trail ahead, where the canyon curved sharply out of view about 30 yards away. That bend matched the rough drawing on the paper almost perfectly. Another page described strange sounds echoing through the canyon at night, though the details were incomplete and difficult to read. The final page contained a short message that seemed written in a rush. It read, "If we do not come back, warn anyone who finds this." For a moment, Ronan simply stared at the paper while the wind pushed loose sand along the canyon floor. The quiet surroundings suddenly felt heavier, as if the walls around him were closing in slowly. He folded the papers again and placed them back inside the plastic sleeve before returning them to the metal box. Then he stood up and looked once more toward the bend, farther down the trail. The sunlight barely reached that section of canyon now, leaving the path ahead covered in long shadows. From where he stood, the narrow passage looked darker than the rest of the trail behind him. Ronan hesitated while considering whether the warnings were part of an elaborate prank or something more serious. Eventually, curiosity won again, and he decided to walk a little farther just to see what lay beyond the bend. He lifted the camera and continued down the path while recording everything around him in steady silence. The canyon grew noticeably tighter as he approached the place marked on the old map inside the metal box. Then, just before reaching the bend, Ronan stopped suddenly. Something else had been carved into the stone at eye level along the right side of the canyon wall. But this carving looked very different from the earlier warnings. Instead of words, the stone showed several deep vertical marks lined closely beside each other. Each mark was nearly a foot long and cut much deeper than any of the messages Ronan had already seen. The camera moved closer as Ronan leaned toward the strange markings for a better look. That was when a faint sound echoed somewhere beyond the bend ahead. At first, it was so quiet the camera microphone barely captured it. But Ronan heard it clearly enough to freeze where he stood. It sounded like a single rock sliding slowly across stone somewhere deeper inside the canyon. Ronan Hale remained completely still after hearing the faint sound echo through the narrow canyon corridor. For several seconds, the camera recorded nothing but the quiet wind moving dust across the rocky ground. He slowly turned his head toward the bend ahead, listening carefully for any sign that something else was moving nearby. The canyon remained silent, though the long walls around him carried even the smallest sound surprisingly far. Ronan whispered that it was probably a small animal knocking loose stones somewhere deeper along the trail. Still, his voice sounded less certain than it had earlier during the hike. He took a few cautious steps toward the bend while holding the camera steady in front of him. The strange vertical markings in the rock remained visible behind him as the path curved out of sight. Those marks would later become one of the most discussed details once investigators reviewed the footage. Each line looked sharp and deliberate, though no tool marks could be clearly identified in the video. When Ronan reached the bend, he paused again and slowly angled the camera around the corner first. The narrow passage opened into a slightly wider section of canyon covered with scattered stones and fallen debris. Nothing moved inside the open space at first glance. The ground looked uneven and sloped gently downward toward another darker corridor farther ahead. Ronan stepped forward carefully and continued recording as he walked into the wider clearing between the canyon walls. A few seconds later, the camera tilted suddenly toward the ground. Part of a human boot appeared in the dust several feet away near the base of the opposite wall. The rest of the shape slowly came into view as Ronan approached. Half buried beneath loose gravel was the skeletal outline of a hiking pack and what remained of a person beside it. The bones were scattered slightly, as if they had been exposed to years of harsh weather. Ronan stopped immediately and lowered the camera while staring at the discovery in stunned silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded quiet and shaken. He said someone must have gotten lost here a long time ago and never found their way back out. Then, he carefully stepped closer to examine the abandoned gear lying beside the remains. The backpack looked extremely old, with faded straps and cracked plastic buckles coated in thick canyon dust. Ronan noticed a small metal tag attached to one of the zippers. He brushed it clean with his thumb and read the faint lettering engraved across its surface. The tag carried a name and a year that had nearly worn away. The camera struggled to focus, but investigators later enhanced the frame during their analysis of the footage. The tag appeared to read a name, followed by the year 1998. That discovery matched the age of the rusted metal box Ronan had found earlier along the trail. It also matched the style of handwriting on the warning notes stored inside the plastic sleeve. For a moment, Ronan looked back toward the direction he had come from earlier that afternoon. The narrow bend now seemed much farther away than it had only minutes before. Then, another sound echoed faintly through the canyon behind him. This time, the noise was clearer than before and lasted slightly longer. It sounded like several small stones sliding down rock somewhere along the path Ronan had already walked. The camera shifted as he turned quickly toward the sound. The trail behind him remained empty, but dust drifted slowly in the air near the bend as if something had just moved through the passage. Ronan stared in that direction for several long seconds without speaking. Finally, he backed away from the skeletal remains and began walking toward the bend again. His footsteps grew faster as he returned along the narrow trail that led back toward the carved warnings. The camera footage shook more with each step as he moved through the tight canyon corridor. When Ronan reached the second carved message, he paused only briefly before continuing toward the first warning. The sunlight near the entrance of the canyon now appeared brighter than before. The last clear video clip ended as Ronan approached the original carved sentence in the canyon wall. The camera pointed directly at the words, telling hikers to turn back while they still could. The recording stopped abruptly a few seconds later. No further footage was found on the camera. Ronan Hale returned home later that evening and reported the discovery to local authorities the next morning. Search teams later recovered the remains inside the canyon and confirmed the person had died many years earlier. Investigators concluded the warnings were likely carved by members of an earlier hiking group searching for their missing friend. The metal box and written notes appeared to have been left as a final attempt to warn others. But one detail from Ronan's footage was never fully explained by those investigators. The drifting dust near the canyon bend suggested something had moved there moments before he looked back. Ronan himself later admitted he never returned to that trail again. He said the warnings had done exactly what they were meant to do. They made sure the next person who found them chose to leave. A night guard logged this detail years too late. A single line in a security log became important long after it should have mattered. The detail sat unnoticed for years, written during a quiet night that felt routine at the time. Evan Ketter was 44 years old and worked as a night guard at a regional medical storage facility on the edge of a mid-sized town. The building stored archived equipment, sealed records, and unused medical supplies from earlier expansions. After business hours, the facility remained empty, quiet, and tightly controlled. Evan worked alone most nights and preferred the isolation. His shift involved timed patrols every hour, camera checks, and handwritten reports kept in a thick binder at the main desk. He trusted routine more than memory and believed details only mattered if they were written down clearly. On a mild spring night in 2012, Evan started his shift just before 10. He reviewed the handover notes left by the day guard and found nothing unusual listed. No late access was scheduled, and all departments officially cleared the building by 9. The first patrol passed without incident. Evan checked the loading bays, emergency exits, and refrigeration corridors, then returned to the desk to log completion. The lighting followed its timers, and the steady hum of cooling units filled the building with constant background noise. Just after midnight, Evan noticed something slightly off while reviewing the camera feeds. A light remained on in the side hallway leading to the old records wing. That hallway usually stayed dark overnight unless maintenance was scheduled. Evan walked down the corridor and reached the records wing door. It was unlocked. He paused, listening for any sound inside, then opened it slowly and stepped into the room. Long rows of metal shelving lined the space, stacked with sealed boxes labeled with dates going back decades. Nothing appeared disturbed. No carts were present, no boxes were shifted, and the dust patterns on the floor looked unchanged. Evan locked the door again and assumed a day employee forgot to secure it before leaving. He considered calling it in, but unlocked doors happened occasionally and rarely meant anything more. Evan decided to mention it in the morning notes and continued his patrol. Around 2 in the morning, Evan heard a faint sound through the ventilation system. It resembled a cart rolling briefly across a hard surface, then stopping abruptly. He stood still, counting seconds, waiting for it to repeat. The sound did not return. Evan checked the camera feed covering the record's wing entrance and nearby hallway. The footage showed the door closed and no movement detected. He marked the sound as inconclusive in his mental checklist and resumed walking. During his next round, Evan noticed something new near the base of the record's wing door. A laminated access badge lay face down against the wall, partly hidden by the baseboard's shadow. It had not been there earlier in the night. Evan picked it up and examined it under the hallway light. The badge carried no printed name, only a faded department code and a magnetic strip worn smooth from use. The design looked older than current employee badges, but still familiar. He tried the badge at a reader near the desk. It did not register. Evan placed it beside the logbook and continued his patrol, assuming someone dropped it earlier and forgot to report it missing. The remainder of the shift passed quietly. No alarms triggered, no doors opened, and no additional sounds traveled through the vents. Evan completed his final patrol just before dawn, checking the records wing one last time. The door remained locked. The hallway light was now off. Everything appeared settled. At the end of the shift, Evan logged the unlocked door and the found badge in the binder. He wrote the entries carefully, noting the time, location, and appearance of the badge. He placed it in the lost property drawer and closed the log. Morning staff arrived shortly after, and the building returned to normal operation. No one asked about the badge, and Evan did not follow up further. At the time, the details seemed minor and safely documented. Years later, that single line in the log would be read again under different circumstances. By then, the moment it described had already passed beyond correction. Time moved forward without drawing attention to the entry Evan wrote that night. Weeks passed, then months, and the medical storage facility continued operating without incident. The binder filled with new pages and older logs were archived into storage cabinets. Evan remained on the night shift and followed the same routines. He noticed no missing inventory, no unusual access requests, and no complaints tied to the records wing. The lost badge stayed in the drawer for several weeks before being boxed with other unclaimed items. During that period, no department reported a missing access badge matching the description Evan logged. Human Resources ran routine audits, and nothing flagged the entry as requiring follow-up. The unlocked door note blended into dozens of similar minor issues. Over the next few years, the facility underwent gradual changes. Departments relocated, storage layouts shifted, and digital systems replaced handwritten access tracking. Evan adapted slowly, continuing to rely on his logs even as procedures evolved. By 2016, the old records wing was officially sealed. Its contents were either digitized or transferred to off-site storage. The hallway leading to it was closed to staff and marked as restricted access. Evan remembered the unlocked door from years earlier when he saw maintenance crews install a permanent barrier. He briefly mentioned it to a supervisor, who dismissed it as unrelated to current operations. The moment passed without discussion. In 2018, the facility faced an internal review following discrepancies found during a compliance check. Investigators reviewed access histories, archived footage, and legacy logs dating back several years. Evan was asked to assist due to his long tenure. He provided his old binders without hesitation. The logs were scanned and indexed, including the entry about the unlocked records wing and the found badge. At the time, Evan did not realize that line would receive special attention. Weeks later, an investigator approached Evan with questions about the badge. They asked where it was found and whether it was ever claimed. Evan repeated what he had written years earlier and explained why he logged it as minor. The investigator explained that the badge code did not match any department active during 2012. According to archived records, the code belonged to a unit dissolved several years earlier before the date of Evan's entry. That detail unsettled Evan. He reviewed the scanned log again and saw his handwriting clearly dated. There was no mistake about the night. The badge style and code should not have existed within active circulation. Investigators continued reviewing access data from that period. They found no authorized entries to the records wing after 9 that evening. Camera footage had long since been overwritten, leaving no visual confirmation. Evan realized the badge and the unlocked door were now being viewed together rather than separately. What once seemed like routine oversights now formed a pattern that no one noticed at the time. Still, the investigation did not reach a conclusion. Without footage or corroborating access logs, the matter remained unresolved. Evan was told to wait while further archival checks were conducted. The binder was returned to storage, and Evan resumed his night shifts. He felt uneasy in a way he had not before. For the first time, he wondered whether writing the detail had happened too late to matter. The investigation concluded months later with findings that arrived quietly rather than dramatically. Evan was called into a small office and asked to review a summary prepared from archived materials and interviews. According to the review, the department code on the badge belonged to a temporary records relocation unit active during a short transition period. That unit operated briefly in 2008, then dissolved after its work was completed. Its access badges were supposed to be collected and destroyed. During that transition, several sealed boxes from the records wing were moved overnight by a contracted crew. Dispatch notes from that period mentioned delayed inventory reconciliation due to staff turnover. No follow-up audit occurred after the unit dissolved. Investigators concluded that an old badge had likely remained in circulation unnoticed for years. The unlocked door and the sound Evan heard could have been related to an unauthorized but routine access by someone who believed the badge was still valid. What troubled them was the timing. According to inventory timestamps, one sealed container from the records wing was last scanned shortly after midnight on the same night Evan logged the badge. The container was never logged at its destination. The container contents were listed as outdated administrative records with no clinical data. The loss was classified as non-critical and written off during a later system migration. No one connected the loss to Evan's log entry at the time. Evan realized then that the detail he recorded had been accurate but insufficient. By the time systems flagged the missing container years later, any immediate investigation window had long closed. The report stated that earlier correlation might have clarified the discrepancy. It also noted that routine logs were rarely reviewed unless prompted by an incident. Evan's entry had remained dormant until years passed. No disciplinary action followed. The incident was classified as a documentation gap compounded by delayed review. Recommendations focused on improving log audits and badge retirement procedures. The records wing remained sealed. The lost container was never recovered and no further evidence emerged. The facility continued operating without public notice of the discrepancy. Evan returned to his night shift with a changed perspective. He continued logging details carefully, but he understood now that timing mattered as much as accuracy. The line he wrote that night had been correct, yet it arrived years too late to change anything. The building stayed quiet, the binder kept filling, and the moment passed into administrative history. For Evan, the night remained clear in memory. A light left on, a door unlocked, a badge on the floor. The system moved forward, but that detail waited, unnoticed, until it no longer mattered.